Hello, good afternoon. I know that I'm standing behind you and the party, so I will not try to prolong this too much. I was told that I have a 50-minute talk, but apparently only 30 minutes, so it will be a little bit faster than it should be. The reason I'm here is that as part of selling MySQL and getting some money, I was part of funding an investment company, and I wanted to help other people succeed. The problem is that I want to invest into open source companies and also want to help other people do similar business with open source that I did with MySQL. It's just really hard to do it. And by helping other companies succeed and find a business model, I have an easier time to help getting them investment. So this is a quote from one open source developer who concluded that if you had the wrong license, you really can't make a sustainable business. So I can't see how everybody here, but so how many here is working on open source? So that's about 5% or less. And how many have their own company or planning to have their own company? No, actually that's also 3–4%. That's good. So I believe that open source is a better way to develop software. There are lots of reasons to it, and here you have the most common ones. I will not go through all the slides because we basically will not have time for that. But I would say that for a company point of view, the most important things with open source is that if you use that in your infrastructure and you build your business on that, you are in charge of your own destiny. Nobody can tell you that suddenly you can't use the software, or there are some limits with the software that you can't do this or this. If the software doesn't evolve in the direction that you want, you can be part of it. And as I said, open source is a better way to develop software because you are not restricted of your own ideas. You get, if you're a successful product, you get more developers, more spread, but you also get things happening in things that you couldn't plan yourself. With MySQL, I always had a vision that this is what I want to do. And then other people gave you patches to solve their own problems that I didn't even know existed. And having MySQL to be a product that was used by the people and the users, and in some part even developed by the users, we got a product that basically changed the database industry. And I could never have done that if MySQL wouldn't have been open source. But the problem is that even if you have an open source project that is popular, it's really hard to create a profitable company that only works on developing software. I think that developing open software is in the human nature because the reason people participate in open source is first because they use the software because it's less expensive. When you start using it and notice that, hey, this is good, you don't want to move away from it. But when you need something new that the community is not developing, you will develop it to solve your own problems. And you are giving it back to the community because you don't want to support the changes, because it's really hard to have your own fork. When creating an open source project, the code is just part of it. Even if you have the best code in the world, it will not help you if you're not participating in the community. You need to, from day one, start with creating community and make it very easy to people to participate. What we do with MariaDB is, we are working on now, is that we are doing a lot of work to make it as easy to be part of the project if you are employed by the MariaDB Corporation or you are a contributor. Everything what we do, all plans are public. This is in sharp contrast with some other companies who are also trying to do open source, but they only deliver all features once a year or every second year, and you have no clue of what will be in the next release, how it will be coded, and you can't participate because they don't have an open community. And transparency, I think, is the most important aspect of a successful open source project, because your users need to know what are you planning to do, how are you going to earn money, if you have a license that is not open source, what's the restrictions, and also what are your plans for the future. So I usually say that in commercial software, usually you pay with money for keeping up or working with the company, while with open source, you use transparency to keep your users. Release early and often. This is a mantra in open source, but it should also be a mantra in closed source, because the longer people wait for the next release and they don't know what to expect, the bigger the reason is that if they're not happy what you are doing or what you have just now, they will move to something else. But if they know what is coming, then they can participate. They can give you feedback. And even having alpha versions out early, they can see that, hey, this is not what we expected, how it should work. So in MariaDB, we just released 10.3 a couple of weeks ago. We already have a 10.4.3. Anybody can participate in it and see what we are planning. All plans are public in the knowledge base. When it comes to open source, lots of people saying that, so is open source successful or not? Is this something that will drive the industry? Some 15 years ago, open source had taken over most of the server farms. Most of the clouds are based on open source. And there were lots of people saying that open source is the way to develop software. But then, unfortunately, we got the phones, where we have lots of apps, and most of those are closed source. So even if most of them, big data industry and everything else is driven by open source, unfortunately, we have lots of more closed source getting developed than ever before. And that's just because there's very few ways to earn as much money with open source as closed source with apps. I still believe it's possible to do that, and this is also something what this talk is about. So one problem I faced early on by trying to do business with open source was that some people said that you shouldn't try to earn money with open source. You should do services around it, but software should be free. The problem is that if you see open source as a real religion instead of a way to develop software, you are limited on what you can do. And there is no way that the open source licenses itself guarantee that you can earn an income on it. And there's really very few companies who has been able to do an IPO on open source. Red Hat, SourceFire, and Hortonworks did do an IPO. MariaDB, MySQL got sold for $1 billion, but it's very few. And that's just because people are still confused with the ways to do money with open source. So there's lots of different open source products and tools, part of the operating system and things. So this, and just to explain the base of the slides. Basically, this is two different talks combined together. First part is how you do a successful open source project, what you need to think about, how you need to work, and also how to create a community around it. And the second part is how to make money with open source and the different ways to do money on it. So when you create a company working open source and you want to have an investment and get somebody to go and pay for your work, for you to be able to expand, this is basically what you will learn. I would say that this is probably the most important slide in the slide deck. If you only do services, basically consulting with customers, helping customers, and you earn 1 million a year, your company is worth 2 million. And if you want to go to an investor and get a 1 million investment, the investor they will take half of your company, if he even wants to invest. Most investors want to have back 10x the money that they put into the company. So service company is really hard to get investment for. But if you do any kind of licenses or have a way to force your customers to pay, you are worth 10x the revenue. So MySQL was sold for $1 billion. We had about 70 million in revenue, so that would have given us a valuation of 700 million. But we also had tens of millions of users, and that's why Sun thought that we were worth 1 billion. When you're creating a company, you also need to think about what do you want to do with a company. I mean, there's different ways to earn money. There's nothing wrong to have a small service company and then have lots of satisfied customers. But I would like to see more companies work with open source, be able to compete with closed source companies and earn as much money that you can earn with a closed source company. And I think that's possible. But in that case, the only way to really earn lots of money is getting sold on the market or go public. There's nothing wrong with just having something that generates money for the founders and employers. So the question is, why should you go open source when it's so much easier to make money with closed source software? I think that if you are a small startup in Europe, it's really hard to compete with, on the same terms with closed source companies in US. With MySQL, I could never have competed with the likes of Oracle and IBM and Microsoft by working on the same terms. You need to do something differently. And one of the things we did was working with open source. So you get much more users, you get much more spread, you get higher quality because the product is used in much more different ways than commercial software because it's so easily to get and test. And it's also much easier to find good developers and partners and customers. One thing that was great with MySQL and also with MariaDB is that when everybody's using your product, it's very easy to go to a company and get them to pay because they already know your product. And if they have, you have good reason for giving them more, if they pay you, that usually is a good business proposition for both of us. So this slide is important because it tells you why people are trusting an open source vendor, because the license is based on the same ideas. Open source is more trustworthy because from a user point of view, because first there's no vendor lock-in. You can continue using the software in spite of who is developing it, and if the developers start to work on something else, you can still continue with using the software. So there's not much that affects your current business. And also there's no trapdoors. That's, for example, why China has, a couple of years ago, decided that they will only allow software in China for which the government can get the source code. Lots of commercial big companies have a problem with that we in open source, we just think that's the right thing to do. We don't mind. For developers, I prefer to use open source, not because I so much examine the code, but when there's a bug, I don't have to wait for the developer to fix it. I can fix it myself and then contribute the bug. Makes me freedom to do more. And if the developer or the product is not supported anymore, I can still get it to work for my own use. So there's lots of freedoms. But still, for a business to go open source, you need to have a sustainable business model, some way that you can be sure that you can continue paying your developers to working on it. So when we're talking about licenses, there's probably several hundred different open source licenses nowadays. But these are the only important ones. And if you do a project, you probably never should use anything else than these. In the beginning of the open source movement, there were lots of new licenses generated, but most of those has disappeared, more or less. So this is from top. You had the most free one. You can do anything, and then when going down, there's some restrictions of what you can do with the licenses. I'm pretty sure that the conference can distribute these slides to you afterwards, because this is a great reference, both what you need to do as an open source company on an open source product, or also how to earn money to it. Please. So of all the different business models that I've seen working in open source, this is a list of all of them. And I have one separate slide for each of those. The most popular one still is the open core model, which basically means that a base of your product is open source, and then you have some closed source add-ons around it. This is a good way to make a business in some cases. But the problem is that from a user point of view, this is not open source in any way or form, because as soon as you have a need of these closed source additions, you have all the same problems as you would have with a closed source project. You can't fix bugs. You're totally depending on one vendor. If they go out of business, you can't use the source anymore. You can't fix things. So all those things, the freedoms and the advantage you have with open source, totally disappears with open core. But of course, in some cases, it may be what your business needs. So there's nothing wrong with it as a business model, but it's not an open source business model. There's lots of people who are doing crowdfunding and also trying to work with donations and advertising. The problem with crowdfunding is that it's very easy to get, or relatively easy, to get crowdfunding for a new product, a new game, the first part. But if you are going to do a program that you want to work for the next 20, 30 years, you can't do it with crowdfunding, because people will not be as excited to pay for the next version or for bug fixes. So you have no way to get continuous revenue to keep up your business. So dual licensing, which we did with MySQL, works great for products that other people want to embed in theirs. So we were the second product who used dual licensing, and the first who did it with GPL. And the idea is that, when working on GPL, is that GPL has a license to say that if this product is GPL, then you can use it freely in your own company. In whatever way you want, you can change it, you can extend it. And this is how Amazon is using with MySQL on their cloud. And they have a special version of MySQL called Aurora that is only available on the cloud, and you can't get the source code. But if you distribute the code to anybody else, everything with the product has to be GPL. And this causes a problem for companies like Adobe. Adobe is including MySQL inside our Adobe. Adobe don't want to change everything to open source. So they come to MySQL and pay to get the license, to get the same code, exactly the same code. With a license, they could connect with Adobe, but without making Adobe open source. And this is how we got, in the beginning, about 70–80% of our revenue, and in the end, around 50% of our revenue. And that's why our valuation was 700 million with MySQL. If it would have been pure open source and only doing support, we would only have been worth 140. So it's a big difference. The problem is that not all programs is such that it makes sense to combine them within one product. If you do a music player or you do an app on your phone, this is not something that other people will combine and want to use. So in that case, unfortunately, dual license doesn't work. And that's why David Axmark, the other founder of MySQL, and me come up with the business source license, which is try to get the best parts of open source, but still ensure a revenue stream to the developers. So the idea is that all code is available. You can use it, you can take the code, you can extend it, you can distribute it, no restrictions. But for some time, there is some limitations of how you use the code. For example, we have in MariaDB, we have a product called MaxScale, which is a proxy, and we say that, and it's under business source license, and we say that if you use it with 1 or 2 servers, then it's free, but if you use it for more, you need to have a license. So this is not better than dual licensing if your code works in a dual license environment. But it's much better than open core, because you can get all the customers who would pay for your extra features to pay for your code in business source. But they still have all the freedoms that they would have if your code would be open source. There's no vendor lock-in, because anybody can fix bugs, anybody can extend the code, all source code is available. For some limited time, they have to pay you. But I am as a software developer users, have never had a problem to pay for software that is useful. But I always would prefer to have the code. So I have never have a vendor lock-in or be depending on a license that I would think that is unreasonable. I hate, for example, products that you have to pay for each year without getting any updates. I like to pay for one product, use it for as long as my computer runs. For a company, I like the fact that business source forces a good behavior, that because your code all code will soon be open source, you have to do releases probably every year with new features, just so you can get the new source under the business, another license, the same license, but with a longer time period. So the recommendation is that it shouldn't be longer than 3 to 4 years before it becomes open source, and you should have a license that allows a lot of people to use it for free, because you want people to use it and spread it. But those who really get the benefit of your code and earn a lot of money, you should get them to pay. So there's lots of articles about business source. There's a similar license, not as explicit how it should work, called fair source. But this article explains in detail what it's all about. There's also lots of confusions because people thought that, oh, the business source license is about making MariaDB business source. It's not about that. It's to allow me to, and others to help people develop open source, even if there's with a time delay. Bruce Perens, one of the authors of the first open source initiative, he has write a blog where he tells that there is a need of a business source license. And there's some projects already using it. MaxScale from MariaDB Corporation. The Apache Kafka tools also are on the business source. I'm also talking with several companies who wants to have OpenOcean, my investment company, to invest into them, and they are thinking about moving to business source just because they can't earn enough money by being open source. One of the common questions you get with both business source and open source, so what about people who are misusing a license and cheat? The thing is that most companies, especially big companies, the risk of getting caught when they are cheating is so high that it's not worth doing that. Just look at what Volkswagen is paying now. Cheating doesn't really work in the long run. And there's enough good companies around that you can run a business around them. So MySQL would have never been possible in the scale that we did if we wouldn't have been able to sell licenses. It's really hard to get companies to pay for just support if there's nothing extra involved. Subscription is good, and even a subscription is just another name for advanced support. But investors are not excited about subscriptions. You need a way to force people to pay. And license is free money. You develop it once, you get lots of people paying for it. And that's why there's lots of companies doing software. So the question, what did MySQL and also MariaDB successful? In the beginning, I created MySQL for my own needs. I had customers needing a really fast database. So when the first version came out, it was quite solid, no big bugs. And we also had extremely lucky, were extremely lucky that it was the right time. Everybody needed a database on the internet. But if we wouldn't have been open source, and probably if we wouldn't have been a virtual company just employing the best people everywhere, MySQL would never have been the success it was. And I also believe that one of the reasons MySQL was successful that we spent a lot of time helping people for free. So during the first 5 years, I personally wrote 30,000 emails just helping people use MySQL, get started with it, and also helping people who had problems with it. And I think that the open sourceness and our want to help people was the one that made MySQL stand in front of lots of other products that was initially much better than MySQL. So that's the question, the talk, and we have 1 minute for all your thousands of questions, hopefully.